The United States and the United Kingdom, two of the most powerful nations across the entire globe. Their histories are deeply intertwined, with one birthed by the other, but these pasts have not always been positive or even peaceful. It's no secret that the start of American history is marked with particular animosity towards the British, but many see the centuries after this period as having only held friendly relations between the two English-speaking nations. This recollection would be partly true, but not entirely. In reality, the 20th century included a brief period of tensions so bad between the UK and the US that they almost went to war. This video is sponsored by Established Titles. Established Titles is a project based on historic Scottish custom, where landowners are referred to as lairds, or lords and ladies in English. They allow you to buy as little as 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Dunfermline, Scotland, and you will get your own lordship title, proved by a certificate with a crest, and by a unique plot number with which you can see the exact location of your land. Getting this certificate, you could officially change your name to Lord or Lady, and get it on your credit card, plane ticket, etc. You can even get it on your dating profiles. Together with their global charity partners One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, they aim to provide a fun and interesting way to help preserve the biodiversity and picturesque woodlands of Scotland, while raising funds to support global afforestation efforts. Therefore, for each order, a tree will be planted. It is also one of the best last-minute gifts ever, a way to surprise your loved ones. You could even get a couple pack for you and your partner, where you can get adjoining plots of land. Click on my link in the description, establishedtitles.com/Nelegia, and use my discount code, Nelegia10, to become a lord or lady today. We all know that the Revolutionary War pitted the mighty British Empire against the rebellious American colonies. This was followed by a stretch of somewhat healthy relations between the new nation and its former empire, and trade between the sovereign territories became quite profitable. Political ties were positive as well, and even when the friendship was threatened by Britain's war with France in the 1790s, the Jay Treaty was effective in staving off any conflict between the unions. It wasn't until the American Republicans came to power after a decade that relations suddenly soured and eventually led to the War of 1812. Following this clash came the Monroe Doctrine and a few decades of off-and-on tensions, but nothing major occurred beyond the Aroostook and Pig Wars, which were both bloodless conflicts. After the American Civil War, the strain between Great Britain and the United States was no better than before, and in retaliation, many American politicians called for more independence to be granted to the Irish, though more likely as an anti-British movement than strongly pro-Irish. Nonetheless, these tensions didn't last too long, and began to let up as the Brits made efforts to reconcile with the Americans and pull out of the region. This resulted in the unifying of Britain's Canadian colonies into the Dominion of Canada, and softening relations between the British Empire and the United States as distance was created. Although some disputes remained all the way up until the outbreak of World War I, the English-speaking nations appeared to be on the right track toward a strong alliance. During the war, the US initially wanted to remain completely neutral, although they did continue to trade with any nation whose own routes were not blocked by the British. Of course, America did eventually enter the war on the side of the Brits, and worked in close cooperation with their former enemy and empire. The US came to British aid in the form of financial and military support, and by the end of the war, it would seem likely that a strong friendship would have been formed. But instead, tensions seemed impossible to prevent once more. The effects of World War I quickly became abundantly evident. The British Empire was in major debt to the United States, owing a whopping $22 billion to its former colonies, which the US refused to turn a blind eye to. Germany was also out of contention as a top naval power on the global stage, but the United States was closing in on the British Royal Navy's numbers. Furthermore, American trade began to encroach upon the Brits, which was something that historically had not gone unpunished. Yet, the British government knew all too well that, especially so soon after the Great War, it would be foolish to start another conflict with the growing American military. The goal was to create a stronger alliance, as opposed to fueling competition between the rival powers. This kept relations between the U.S. and Britain fairly cordial, despite some suppressed resentment and distrust. These hidden feelings were not insignificant, though. While relations were pleasant enough at face value, both sides had some concerns, and even considered the thought of a new war. From the British point of view, if a war did break out, despite their efforts to avoid it, it would likely be related to commercial connections and America's expanding trade. Knowing the new height of America's naval strength, and acknowledging that neither side would ever be likely to sit by and allow their trade to be restricted or interrupted by the other, as the US had hesitantly done during World War I concerning Britain's decision to block the trade with Germany. This was the primary concern of the British. Strictly, it was assumed that any war would be a product of circumstances, and not fully intentional. For the Americans, though, the idea of war with another nation in the near future was actually pretty common, and even anticipated by some. So much so, actually, that the US had made war preparations for a battle with multiple countries. War Plan Orange, War Plan Green, and War Plan Yellow were some of the strategies in the case that a war was to break out against Japan, Mexico, or China. This then made it less surprising that the Americans concocted War Plan Red, a method for defeating both the Brits and Canadians if ever necessitated. War Plan Red had one main objective: prevent the Brits from being able to utilize Canada to gain an advantage over America. The thought was that Canada would be an undoubted ally of Great Britain, and would also be used as a launching point for the British troops themselves. This prompted the US to fear a potential invasion from the Canadian border, and react by planning their own. The first step of the plan was to enter Canada and capture major cities such as Halifax, which the Americans predicted would be used by the Royal Navy as an import base during a war with the States. The American troops would also target Vancouver, Winnipeg, the Canadian power plants throughout Niagara Falls region, and eventually engage in a full-scale invasion to seize Montreal, Toronto, and Quebec as well. In response, the US predicted a small counterattack by land from the Canadians, which would likely be mostly focused on protecting the port city of Halifax from the American Army-Navy offensive. With all of this in consideration, the Americans were fairly confident that if they were able to execute this assault preemptively, they would be able to take the upper hand before British troops could even arrive. However, Canada had its own plan. Knowing that their land forces were dangerously overpowered by the Americans, as were even the Brits, the Canadians came up with a strategy that could simply buy them time until their British allies could come to their aid. The aim was to launch a rapid-fire assault across the American border and push in as far as they could before running into American troops. At this point, the Canadians would begin to fall back, whilst destroying any and all infrastructure they could, in order to stall the American counterattack and imminent invasion. The assumption was that, by the time the Americans could arrive at the Canadian border, the Brits would have been able to cross the Atlantic and join up with the Canadian forces to defend their land. This too would have prevented the US from carrying out their own War Plan Red. The catch in all of this, though, was that the British never seemed to have any plans for mass deployment of troops or ships to support Canada in the case of war. The Royal Navy saw the upper hand being with the US from the start, and felt that it would be a waste to try and defend the vast majority of Canadian land. The only tactics that were loosely discussed were the aims of attacking the Americans from places such as Bermuda and the West Indies, as opposed to waiting for the US Navy to cross the Atlantic, which would likely cause a major threat to British trade and could even result in a swift British surrender. Further than this, though, the Brits didn't seem to feel a need to make an official plan in the same way that the US or even Canada had. Luckily for all involved, none of these plans were ever needed. The Canadians even went as far as to burn all copies of their defense plan, and the US eventually dismissed War Plan Red as well. When the Second World War broke out, any hard feelings between the United States and Great Britain would eventually be swept under the rug, as an alliance was once again necessitated. This, too, may have put the whole situation into perspective, as the results of World War II included even closer ties between the former empires and colonies, and as far as we know, there are no contemporary equivalents for War Plan Red on either side of the Atlantic. If one is left wondering why this plan never existed to begin with, the answer lies in the politics of the times. Despite the history of these culturally and linguistically similar nations being stained here and there with political disputes and military conflicts, the development of rivalry, particularly in the form of trade competition, appears to be the main driving factor in Britain's worries about a potential war, and likely played a role in the US's caution as well. Still, as mentioned earlier, America had lined out hypothetical war plans for multiple nations that they were peaceful with at the time. So, from that side of the Atlantic at least, they tried to be prepared for any event.